Steel bends against your ribs. You're knocked backward into the dust before you even draw your sword. You look down in confusion. A wooden shaft is vibrating in your chest plate. Then another arrow hits your shoulder with brutal force. Then a third strikes your thigh. You try desperately to stand, but the weight is crushing you into the ground. You're not dying. Your chainmail is holding against the impacts. But you're being hammered into the earth by pure kinetic force alone, like a nail being driven into wood by an invisible hammer. And the hammering never stops. You look to your left through the chaos. A destrier warhorse screams in agony, rearing up with blood spraying from its punctured neck in bright red arcs. Then it crashes down, crushing the squire beneath its massive weight. You hear bones crack. You look to your right, desperately seeking help. Your comrades aren't men anymore. They're living porcupines bristling with 20-30 arrows, each stumbling blindly forward through a suffocating fog of dust and death. This is the Battle of Dorylaeum. Its dawn on July 1, 1097. The First Crusade has just walked straight into a meat grinder specifically designed to destroy them. 8,000 Christians are trapped in a valley completely paralyzed by a storm of arrows so thick and continuous it literally blocks out the morning sun. 25,000 Seljuk Turks are circling them like wolves around wounded prey, screaming like demons from hell, refusing to engage in close combat, refusing to stop firing those deadly composite bows. This isn't a battle by any definition you understand. It's a systematic slaughter, and the most powerful, most feared knights on earth are completely helpless to stop it. How did the greatest warriors of Christendom end up trapped like animals? How did men who had conquered entire kingdoms find themselves dying without ever striking a blow? The answer is simple, and it's a lesson that echoes through military history. Arrogance kills faster than any arrow. Just weeks ago, these same Crusaders had captured the city of Nicosia in a stunning victory. They thought the war was essentially over. They thought Sultan Kilij Arslan of the Seljuk Turks was running for his life in terror, that he'd given up and retreated into the eastern deserts. They celebrated their victory with wine and songs, convinced they were invincible. They were catastrophically wrong about everything. Kilij Arslan wasn't running away in fear. He was hunting them. While the Crusaders drank and celebrated their triumph, he was riding across the steppes of Anatolia with a single promise: to unite the fractious Turkish tribes, death to the invaders. Wealth beyond measure for those who joined him, the destruction of the Iron Men from the west, and the Crusaders, blind with confidence and drunk on their recent success, made the ultimate tactical mistake that would cost thousands of lives. They split their forces. Bohemond of Taranto, leading the Norman contingent, took the vanguard 10,000 souls, including soldiers, pilgrims, women, and servants, and marched ahead, confidently leaving the heavy infantry and the main army under Godfrey of Bouillon miles behind. He marched them straight into the kill zone that Kilij Arslan had prepared. At dawn, with the sun just breaking over the Anatolian hills, the trap snapped shut with devastating precision. There was no warning, no scouts reporting enemy movement, just the sudden deafening roar of kettle drums echoing off the surrounding hills like thunder. Then the skyline vanished, completely replaced by thousands upon thousands of mounted archers, appearing like demons summoned from hell itself. They poured down the slopes in an unstoppable wave, moving like a landslide of death. The Crusaders didn't even have time to form proper defensive lines. The first volley of arrows hit before most men had drawn their swords, and the screaming began immediately. The trap was absolutely perfect in its execution. The vanguard was alone, surrounded on all sides, and dying faster than anyone could have imagined. But what happened in the next 7 hours would either save or destroy the entire First Crusade. The question is, could anyone survive what was coming? Before we dive deeper into this incredible story of survival against impossible odds, make sure you hit that subscribe button for Maproom battles. What you're about to hear will change how you think about courage, endurance, and what human beings are truly capable of when everything is on the line. The natural instinct of a European knight when faced with an enemy is always to charge forward. It's what they're bred for from childhood. It's what their entire military doctrine, their whole worldview of combat is built upon. You take 1,000 pounds of horse and man armor them in iron rings, point a 12-foot lance forward, and you smash directly into the enemy line like a battering ram powered by rage and training. Physics does the rest. The lance punches through shields. The horse tramples bodies. The enemy line breaks. You win. It's that simple. It's been that simple for generations. In Europe, fighting against other heavy cavalry or against static infantry formations, this tactic was absolutely devastating. It was the nuclear weapon of the 11th century. Nothing could stand against a proper knightly charge. Entire battles were decided in the first 30 seconds, when the cavalry hit. So when the initial shock of the ambush wore off, and the Norman knights managed to catch their breath through the arrow storm, they did exactly what they were trained to do since they were old enough to hold a practice sword. They screamed their traditional war cries that had terrified enemies from Ireland to Sicily. They spurred their heavy destrier war horses into a thundering gallop. They lowered their 12-foot lances with iron tips, aiming for the chest of the nearest Turkish rider, fully expecting to skewer him and shatter the encirclement through pure brute force and superior weight. They hit absolutely nothing but empty air. This is where the tactical genius of Kilij Arslan and the Seljuk Turks becomes terrifyingly brilliantly clear. They weren't playing by European rules that the Crusaders assumed were universal laws of combat. They had their own playbook perfected over centuries on the steppes of Central Asia. As the Crusaders charged forward with their heavy lances lowered and their blood pumping with combat fury, the Turkish line didn't brace for impact the way European soldiers would. It didn't lock shields. It didn't plant spears. It simply evaporated like morning mist. The Turkish riders, mounted on nimble, lightning-fast steppe ponies bred for endurance and maneuverability, wheeled their mounts around with practiced ease and galloped away from the charging knights. But they weren't fleeing in panic or cowardice. They were executing a tactical maneuver that was older than Rome itself. As they rode away at full gallop, they twisted completely around in their saddles with the flexibility of men who'd been riding since age 3, drew their powerful composite bows back to their ears and unleashed coordinated volleys of arrows backward at the pursuing knights. This was the legendary Parthian shot, named after the Parthian Empire, that had destroyed Roman legions with this exact tactic 1,000 years earlier. It was devastatingly effective then. It was still devastating now. The Crusaders found themselves chasing ghosts through the dust. The heavy European war horses, magnificent animals, but burdened by the enormous weight of chainmail armor, and exhausted from days of forced marching through the Anatolian heat, simply could not close the gap with the lighter step ponies. They were like Formula One race cars trying to chase dirt bikes across broken rocky terrain. The physics didn't work in their favor. Every single time a knight urged his mount forward, pushing for more speed, the Turkish rider stayed just barely out of lance range, maintaining that perfect distance where they could shoot, but couldn't be touched, peppering the knight's horse with arrows until the magnificent beast stumbled, collapsed, and died with foam pouring from its mouth. The result was a tactical nightmare that no European military manual had ever prepared them for. The Crusader charged that unstoppable weapon that had won 1,000 battles would lose all momentum within minutes. The horses would literally blow out their lungs from exhaustion. And the moment the knights were forced to stop and turn back toward their own defensive lines, hoping to regroup, the Turks would immediately swarm in again, closer this time, firing at point-blank range where even chainmail couldn't fully protect. It was exactly like trying to fight a swarm of wasps with a sledgehammer. The harder you swing, the more energy you waste, the more exhausted you become, and the more you get stung. and eventually you collapse from exhaustion while the wasps are barely tired. You have to understand the technological mismatch that made this possible. The Turkish composite bow was an absolute masterpiece of engineering that took years to craft properly. Made from wood horn and sinew carefully laminated together in precise layers, it had a draw weight immense enough to launch an arrow hundreds of yards with lethal force. Yet it was short enough to be fired easily from horseback, unlike the massive English longbows that required standing on solid ground. It was effectively the machine gun of the Middle Ages, rapid-fire death from a distance. In the hands of a trained Seljuk warrior who had literally been riding horses since before he could walk, who had been shooting arrows at targets since age 5, it could fire a new arrow every 5 seconds with remarkable accuracy. Now multiply that rate of fire by 25,000 riders. The mathematics of death become truly horrific. That's potentially 100,000 arrows filling the air every single minute, darkening the sky, falling like deadly rain. The Battle of Dorylaeum very quickly stopped being anything resembling a battle and started becoming a one-sided massacre. The valley floor was rapidly littered with the bodies of dead and dying horses. Knights who'd been stripped of their mounts were forced to fight on foot, trudging through the choking dust in 70 pounds of heavy armor under the blazing July sun. They were slow, half-blind, with sweat stinging their eyes and desperately easy targets for the circling Turkish archers. The sophisticated ambush tactics, perfected on the steppes, were systematically dismantling the pride of Christendom piece by piece, and the day had barely begun. The real nightmare was still ahead. Could anyone possibly survive what was coming next? Bohemond of Taranto, watching the disaster unfold from the center of the camp, realized the catastrophic reality within the first brutal hour. He saw his best knights, men he'd fought beside for years, veterans of a dozen campaigns, charge out with courage and fury, only to be isolated, surrounded, and methodically cut down by arrows before they could strike a single blow. He realized with sickening clarity that continuing to attack was absolute suicide. If they kept charging out in small groups trying to break through the Turkish encirclement, they would simply be drawn apart and slaughtered piecemeal in the hills where the bodies would never be recovered. The only thing keeping them alive in this hellish situation was the density of their formation. The shield wall, the human fortress. So, Bohemond made a decision that went against every single instinct of a medieval warrior, every lesson he'd been taught, every impulse screaming in his brain. He ordered the trumpet to sound retreat. He commanded his knights, proud men who'd rather die than show weakness, to stop attacking immediately, to stand fast where they were and take the punishment. The orders went down the line through the chaos: do not break formation under any circumstances. Fall back to the camp. Protect the center. He was effectively surrendering the battlefield to the enemy. He was ordering his men to stand in place like targets and absorb arrows. It was humiliating. It went against everything they believed about warfare and honor. But it was also the only possible way to survive. It was a desperate gamble based on cold tactical calculation. Bohemond needed to compress his scattered forces into a tight defensive ball, using the mass of bodies and shields to create a fortress made of flesh and iron. He desperately hoped that if they could just hold out, if they could somehow survive this reign of death long enough, reinforcements might arrive from the main army. But he had absolutely no way of knowing if Godfrey of Bouillon even knew they were under attack. The main army was miles away. The messengers he'd sent might be dead in a ditch somewhere with Turkish arrows in their backs. The Crusader perimeter began to shrink as men fell back in organized retreat toward the river. A shallow, marshy stream, called the Thimbers, offered their only protection against attacks from the rear. The defensive circle became tighter and tighter. Knights, foot soldiers, women priests, and terrified pilgrims were pressed together in a frightened mass. The screams of the wounded mixed with the prayers of clergy. The dust kicked up by thousands of circling Turkish horses created a suffocating brown fog that reduced visibility to just a few yards. You couldn't see the enemy clearly. You could only hear them, the thunder of hooves, the screaming war cries, the whistle of arrows. Inside that dust cloud, the temperature was rising dramatically. The water supplies were running dangerously low, and the arrows kept falling in endless waves. They never stopped. Ever. Kilij Arslan, watching from his command position on the high ground, must have smiled with satisfaction. He had them exactly where he wanted them. The invaders were trapped like cattle in a pen with nowhere to run. He didn't need to risk his valuable warriors in dangerous close combat. He could just sit back comfortably and let his archers finish the job with methodical precision. He was dissecting the Crusader army with the skill of a surgeon, cutting away their strength piece by piece. The Iron Men from the West were finally learning that their heavy armor and pride meant nothing against mobility and arrows. This was his kind of warfare. This was how the Stepes had always fought. As the sun climbed higher into the merciless Anatolian sky, a new enemy joined the battle that was just as deadly as the Turkish arrows, the heat itself. It's midday in July on the Anatolian plateau. The temperature is pushing past 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, but there is no shade anywhere. And inside a full suit of chainmail armor with a padded gambeson underneath it feels like being locked inside an oven that's slowly cooking you alive. The Crusaders are literally cooking in their own sweat. Dehydration begins setting in, fast clouding their judgment, making their limbs feel like lead weights, slowing their reactions to a crawl. Yet they cannot remove their helmets, even for a second, to catch a breath of air. To remove a single piece of armor for even a moment is to invite immediate death because the arrows never stop falling. Kilij Arslan has organized his horsemen into a brilliantly efficient, relentless rotating system of death. Military historians who study this battle liken it to a carousel of killing. One wave of Turkish riders gallops in close, releases their arrows at near point-blank range, where the impact is devastating, then wheels away smoothly to the rear to rest their horses and resupply arrows from the baggage train. As they retreat in perfect order, a fresh wave immediately takes their place without even a second's gap. There is no pause in the bombardment, no moment of blessed silence. No chance for the Crusaders to catch their breath, reorganize their lines, or even think clearly. It's a continuous, rhythmic bombardment that lasts for hours and hours without mercy. We need to talk about the brutal physics of this slaughter to truly understand what these men endured. European chainmail armor, the hauberk, was an absolute marvel of medieval engineering. Each one took hundreds of hours to craft with thousands of individual iron rings riveted together. It was designed primarily to stop the slashing edge of a sword or the chopping blow of an axe. It was flexible enough to allow movement while providing excellent protection against most medieval weapons. But against the high-velocity puncture of a composite bow arrow fired from increasingly close range, it had serious limits. As the Turkish circle tightens around the trapped Crusaders throughout the morning, the effective range keeps decreasing. At 50 yards distance, the chainmail generally holds firm. The arrows hit hard but don't penetrate through to flesh. But at 20 yards or less, the physics change dramatically. The heavy bodkin point arrows used by Turkish archers shaped specifically to pierce armor begin to burst through the riveted rings with shocking force. They punch through the padding underneath and bite deep into flesh. They don't always kill instantly, but they maim effectively. They disable warriors, making them useless for fighting. Men are dropping to the ground not because they're dead, but because the accumulated pain of a dozen shallow wounds scattered across their bodies makes standing upright physically impossible. Some are hit 10, 15, 20 times and still alive, transformed into those living porcupines stumbling blindly through the dust. But the true tragedy of Dorylaeum, the loss that breaks hearts, isn't actually the men. It's the horses. The destrier warhorse is the single most valuable asset a knight possesses. It's worth a fortune, often more than a peasant family will earn in their entire lifetimes. These horses are trained carefully for years, treated like family members, loved deeply by their riders. But unlike their armored riders, the horses are completely unarmored. They're naked, vulnerable targets. Their bodies are huge and impossible to miss even in the chaos and dust. The Turks know this weakness intimately. They deliberately target the mounts rather than the riders. Kill the horse and the knight becomes just another foot soldier struggling in heavy armor. The scene inside the shrinking Crusader circle is a chaotic nightmare of thrashing dying beasts in their final agonies. A horse takes an arrow deep in the flank. It rears up on its hind legs, bucking violently, throwing its rider hard into the ground. Another takes a shaft directly in the eye, screaming in a way that sounds terrifyingly human, more horrible than any human scream. Then it collapses sideways, trampling the foot soldiers huddled nearby, who can't move fast enough to escape. The pride of the Crusader cavalry, these magnificent trained war horses worth their weight in gold, is being systematically exterminated without ever being given a chance to charge the enemy. It's not just a tactical defeat. It's an emotional devastation for men who love these animals. Bohemon's desperate order to stand fast and hold position is the only thing preventing total annihilation at this point. But maintaining that discipline requires almost superhuman willpower. Imagine standing in a packed shield wall while your beloved horse dies in agony beside you, while your brother in arms falls with an arrow through his throat, drowning in his own blood, while the sun literally boils your brain inside your helmet, and being told firmly, do not move from this spot. Do not break formation. Stand and take it. The perimeter keeps shrinking foot by foot. The dead bodies of men and horses are now being used as makeshift ramparts stacked up as improvised walls. The Crusaders are no longer functioning as an army. They're a huddled mass of desperate survivors with their backs literally against the marshy banks of the Thimbers River, fighting for every breath. Could you have done it? Could you have stood there hour after hour while death rained from the sky? We're about to find out who has what it takes to survive hell itself. The water is their only remaining lifeline, but it's quickly becoming choked with corpses and running red with blood. The Seljuk Turks, seeing the obvious lack of resistance, are growing bolder with each passing hour. They press closer to the defensive perimeter. Their taunts become louder and more confident. They can literally smell the panic and desperation. They know the Franks are breaking. They know it's just a matter of time now. Kilij Arslan prepares for the final phase of his perfect battle, the kill. By early afternoon, the battlefield has transformed completely. What began as a sprawling camp spread across the valley floor has been compressed through hours of retreat into a tight, suffocating knot of desperate humanity barely 100 yards across. The Crusader perimeter is no longer a defensive line. It's a desperate huddle with backs pressed against the river shields, locked together in a fragile shell that's cracking. This is the phase of any battle where military discipline usually collapses entirely. It's one thing to stand in a proper line of battle with room to swing a sword, with officers nearby with clear objectives. It's something completely different to be crushed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of screaming people stepping on the bodies of the fallen, because there's literally nowhere else to put your feet, unable to see anything through the dust, hearing men die on all sides. The shrinking circle is a psychological torture device more effective than any rack. As the Turks press inward relentlessly, the Crusaders are forced to retreat step by bloody step. Every yard of ground lost is a yard they will never recover. The noose is tightening. Inside this shrinking pocket of terror, the distinction between soldier and civilian has vanished completely. The arrows are falling blindly into the center of the packed mass, now striking knights, priests, women, and servants with equal randomness. There's no safe place, nowhere to hide. The noise is absolutely deafening, a cacophony of desperate prayers to God and various saints, screams of the wounded, the constant clash of arrows striking shields, and the relentless demonic pounding of the Turkish war drums that seem to be getting inside everyone's heads, driving them toward madness. The smell is overpowering in the stagnant, trapped air. Blood, sweat, fear, death, horse manure, and the sickly sweet smell of opened bodies baking in the heat. Men are vomiting from the stench and the stress. Some are losing control of their bowels. It's the most primal kind of terror. Bohemond of Toronto is riding along the inner perimeter constantly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a sword. He's the only glue holding this shattered army together at this point. He knows with absolute certainty that if the circle breaks anywhere, if a single significant gap opens in the shield wall, the Turks will pour through with their sabers drawn, and the massacre will become absolute. Every man, woman, and child will be cut down. He screams at his men repeatedly, "Stand fast, trust in Christ, the Lord is with us." Do not break. His voice is going hoarse, but he never stops. But Bohemond is a pragmatist, not just a religious believer. He knows that faith alone won't stop 25,000 horsemen. He needs a miracle. He needs an army to arrive. Earlier in the battle, in a moment of desperate foresight that would end up deciding the fate of the entire crusade, Bohemond had dispatched messengers. 2 riders, stripped of their heavy armor to lighten their horses as much as possible, had broken out of the encirclement at full gallop, just as the trap was closing in those first chaotic minutes. Their mission was brutally simple, but terrifying ride like the wind itself. Find the main army under Godfrey of Bouillon, somewhere in these mountains. Tell them we are dying. Tell them to come now. But Bohemond has absolutely no way of knowing if they made it through. Did they get through the Turkish lines? Are they lying dead in a ditch somewhere with arrows in their backs, or are they hopelessly lost in the maze of Anatolian hills? For the men and women trapped in this shrinking circle of death, there is no news from the outside world. There is only the horizon filled with enemies, as far as the eye can see. They look to the hills, not with hope of salvation, but with dread, expecting to see yet another wave of fresh Turkish archers arriving to join the killing. The pressure is immense and growing. Some of the foot soldiers, driven literally mad by hours of bombardment, try to break rank and hide among the baggage wagons or burrow under the riverbanks, like animals seeking shelter. The knights have to physically shove them back into line using the flats of their swords. "If we break, we all die," becomes the desperate mantra repeated over and over. It's a grim, grinding battle of pure endurance now. Victory doesn't exist anymore as a concept. There's only survival measured in minutes. Will anyone live to see sunset in the annals of military history stretching back thousands of years? The spotlight is almost always exclusively on the men holding the swords. We talk endlessly about the knights, the archers, the generals, and their tactical genius. We build statues of them. We name streets after them. But at the Battle of Dorylaeum, the line between victory and total annihilation was held together not by ironclad warriors, but by people who were never supposed to be anywhere near a battlefield at all. As the sun reached its zenith, climbing to its highest and hottest point in the sky, thirst became a killer more efficient than any Turkish arrow. You have to imagine the physiology of a knight in that specific moment to understand the crisis. He's been fighting continuously for 6 hours in what's essentially a metal oven. He's dehydrated to the point of delirium. His tongue is swollen in his mouth like a piece of leather. His vision is blurring. His thoughts are becoming confused and sluggish. The dehydrated soldier is a useless soldier. He can't hold his shield up properly. He creates dangerous gaps in the shield wall. He collapses. And when he collapses, the enemy breaks through and everyone dies. It's that simple and that terrifying. This is where the Gesta Francorum, the eyewitness chronicle of the Crusade, written by an anonymous soldier who was actually there in the circle, records a detail that's often completely left out of the history books and Hollywood movies. It tells us that amidst this reign of death and chaos, the women of the camp stepped forward. These were the wives, the sisters, and the daughters of the soldiers. They were pilgrims who'd walked thousands of miles to reach the Holy Land. They had absolutely no armor. They had no shields. They wore simple wool or linen tunics that offered exactly zero protection against the razor-sharp bodkin arrows falling constantly from the sky. Yet they didn't cower helplessly in the baggage wagons as everyone would have expected. They grabbed pitchers, buckets, and leather water skins. They ran to the muddy, blood-streaked river, and then they ran straight toward the front lines where the fighting was most intense. Picture this scene clearly. The air is thick with whizzing shafts that sound like angry hornets. Men are screaming and dying on all sides. And weaving through this carnage with incredible courage are women running directly into the kill zone carrying water. They brought water to the men standing in the shield wall, tipping clay jugs into the parched mouths of knights who couldn't lower their shields even for a second. They brought comfort to the dying men bleeding out in the dust, holding their hands and whispering prayers so they wouldn't die alone and afraid. The chronicler writes with simple eloquence that they were bearing water and comforting the fighters. It sounds gentle and peaceful when you read it. But in the context of Dorylaeum, it was an act of supreme heroism that deserves to be remembered. Every single trip to the river was a gamble with death. Many of these women were struck down by arrows. We don't know their names.
History rarely bothered to record the names of camp followers and pilgrims.
But their impact was absolutely strategic and changed everything. They provided two crucial things, hydration and shame. The hydration kept the knights physically capable of standing and fighting, but the psychological impact was even more powerful and important. Imagine being a terrifying Norman knight, exhausted and ready to give up, ready to drop your shield and surrender to the heat and the arrows. Then you see a woman, perhaps your own wife, perhaps a complete stranger, standing right next to you in the shield wall, completely exposed and vulnerable, offering you water with steady hands while arrows are striking the ground all around her feet. How can you break when she won't? How can you run when she's standing firm? The bravery of these unnamed women shamed the men into finding reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. They stiffened their spines. They locked their shields tighter. The line held because the women absolutely refused to let it break. This moment challenges everything we think we know about medieval warfare. The role of women in the Crusades wasn't passive or helpless. In the desperate heat of Dorylaeum, they were the crucial logistics corps that kept the engine of war running when it should have ground to a halt. They were the steel spine hidden inside the soft flesh of the camp. Without them and their incredible courage, the vanguard almost certainly would have collapsed from heat stroke long before any reinforcements could arrive. But even with this heroic effort, the situation continues to deteriorate. The end is very near now. The water is running dangerously low despite the women's efforts. The river is turning into a disgusting swamp of mud and gore barely drinkable. And the Turks are getting noticeably bolder with each passing hour. They can sense that the living porcupines are finally truly weakening after 7 hours of punishment. The volume of arrows actually increases. The circle shrinks another 10 yards. The end seems inevitable. Bohemond of Taranto, seeing his perimeter collapsing inward, like a dying star, plays his final desperate card. He orders a total withdrawal to the very edge of the Thimbers River, giving up the last open ground. This isn't a chaotic rout. It's a calculated, controlled contraction. He's using the geography of the land itself as a defensive weapon. By placing the backs of his army directly against the marshy riverbank, he eliminates the threat of being attacked from behind. The soft, muddy ground along the water makes it essentially impossible for the Turkish horses to charge effectively from that direction. Their hooves would get stuck. The Crusaders are no longer a mobile army capable of maneuver. They have deliberately transformed themselves into a fortress made of human flesh, but a fortress nonetheless. The foot soldiers and the dismounted knights lock their kite shields together rim to rim with practiced precision, creating a continuous wall of wood and leather. Behind this shield wall, the spearmen level their weapons outward, projecting a bristling thicket of sharp steel points. They have become a hedgehog. This shield wall formation is one of the oldest and most effective defensive formations in all of military history, dating back to the ancient Greeks. but maintaining it under continuous fire requires nerves of absolute steel. You have to trust the man next to you completely with your life. If he flinches, if he drops his shield for even 1 second to wipe the stinging sweat from his eyes, a gap opens and you both die. It's that simple. The Norman knights, stripped of their beloved horses, form the iron core of this desperate wall. These are men who have spent literally their entire lives from childhood training for war. And even in this extremity, their discipline holds firm. They stand shoulder to shoulder, crouching low, to protect their vulnerable legs, listening to the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of arrows slamming into the front of their shields. For Kilij Arslan, watching from his command position, this is becoming frustrating. He has killed thousands of valuable horses. He has wounded thousands of men. The valley floor is carpeted with Crusader dead, but the stubborn core of the Crusader army is still intact, still organized, curled up like a wounded animal that absolutely refuses to die, no matter how many times you stab it. The arrows are running low in his supply train. The sun is beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. The Sultan realizes with growing annoyance that the Parthian shot tactics have done all the damage they're going to do. The shield wall is too tight. The men are too disciplined. To finish this slaughter, he's going to have to get his hands dirty with close combat. Around mid-afternoon, the tempo of the entire battle shifts dramatically. The constant rain of arrows begins to slacken, noticeably. The endless thunder of hooves quiets. For one terrifying moment, there is near silence on the battlefield. But it's not the silence of peace or mercy. It's the silence of a predator crouching before it leaps for the kill. The Turkish riders begin to unsling their curved sabers and brutal maces from their saddles. They tighten their saddle girths, checking their equipment. They form up in dense blocks, preparing to abandon their successful hit and run tactics for one massive, overwhelming charge. They're going to smash into the shield wall with everything they have, ride over the top of the defenders, and push the survivors into the river to drown in their armor. Inside the Crusader lines, the priests begin giving the last rites and massy blessing hundreds of men at once. Men confess their sins to one another, hastily knowing what the silence means. They grip their swords with sweaty, bloody hands, bracing for the impact that will end their crusade forever. Bohemond stands in the center, exhausted but still unbroken, watching the enemy massing on the hills. He has held out for nearly 7 hours. He has done the impossible, but without a miracle arriving in the next few minutes, the 8th hour will be their last. Is anyone coming to save them? The silence shatters like glass. Kilij Arslan gives the signal and 25,000 riders surge forward as one massive wave. This time, they don't fire and retreat. They don't turn away. They commit fully to close combat. The Seljuk cavalry, armed with curved sabers, maces, and battle axes, crashes into the Norman shield wall with the force of a tsunami hitting a seawall. If the 7-hour arrow storm was psychological torture designed to break spirits, this melee is pure physical trauma designed to break bodies. The sound of the impact is absolutely sickening, the crunch of wood splintering, the clash of steel on steel, and the dull thud of horses smashing into human bodies at full gallop. The Crusader line buckles dangerously. It bends inward like a bow being drawn back, the men in the front rank being physically pushed backward by the weight of charging horses. But miraculously, impossibly, it does not break completely. The hedgehog holds through sheer will. This phase of the battle is a grinding, claustrophobic nightmare. In a melee like this, there is no grand strategy anymore. There's no clever tactics. There's only the man directly in front of you trying to cave your skull in with a mace. The Crusaders are fighting with the desperate fury of men who have absolutely nowhere to run. They stab upward with their spears into the soft bellies of the Turkish horses. They hack at the legs of the riders with axes. It's brutal, unglamorous, exhausting work. Bohemond himself is in the thick of it, right in the front line. The chronicles describe him shouting encouragement, fighting like a demon, rallying his men with his personal example. "Stand fast for Christ," he screams until his voice is hoarse, his armor splattered with blood. Stand fast, they cannot break us, but even he knows the cold mathematics are against them. They have been fighting continuously for 7 hours in the blazing heat, without food or rest or relief. Their arms are heavy with fatigue. Their reactions are slowing dangerously. Every time a Crusader falls with a Turkish blade in his chest, a gap opens in the shield wall and the Turks push harder, sensing the kill is near. Kilij Arslan is ecstatic, practically dancing in his saddle. He has the invaders pinned against the river with no escape route. He is literally minutes away from total victory, from annihilating the vanguard of the Crusade and sending a message that will echo across Christendom. He is so focused on the slaughter happening in the valley below, so fixated on the prey dying in front of him, that he commits what will prove to be a fatal tactical error. He forgets to look up at the surrounding hills. He forgets to post scouts on the ridges. He forgets that Bohemond wasn't the entire Crusader army. It starts as a subtle vibration in the ground, easy to miss. A faint rumble, separate from the chaos of the melee. Then it becomes distinct, growing stronger with each passing second. High on the ridge to the southwest, a massive cloud of dust begins to rise into the air. Kilij Arslan likely glances at it dismissively and smiles, thinking it's more of his own tribesmen arriving late to join the plunder and share in the glory. But then the wind shifts direction. The dust clears just enough to see, and out of the haze emerges a sight that freezes the blood of every Turkish warrior on the field. It's a forest, a moving forest of lances held high. And flying above them are not the horsetail banners of the steppes, but the heavy embroidered standards of Western Europe. The golden cross of Lorraine, the banners of France and Germany. Godfrey of Bouillon has arrived, and he hasn't come alone. He's brought the entire main army. This is the ride of the Rohirrim moment of the First Crusade, except it's not fantasy, it's real history. Godfrey had received Bohemond's desperate messengers hours ago. He didn't hesitate or debate. He forced his heavy infantry and knights to march at an absolutely killing pace across the mountains, pushing them beyond normal human endurance. They arrived not a moment too soon. And crucially, they arrived on the high ground with momentum. Suddenly, the entire geography of the battle flips upside down. The trap has inverted. Kilij Arslan thought he had the Crusaders surrounded in the valley, but now his own army is sandwiched between Bohemond's desperate survivors at the river and Godfrey's fresh army on the ridge. The hunter has just become the hunted. Could the Crusaders actually pull off the impossible? The Turks in the rear ranks of the melee stop fighting immediately? They point frantically to the hills. Panic infectious and swift as plague begins to ripple through the Seljuk lines like a wave. The Crusaders, trapped in the hedgehog formation, seeing the blessed banners of their comrades appearing like salvation itself, find a sudden violent surge of energy they didn't know they still possessed. They stop retreating. They push back against their attackers. The scream goes up from the riverbank, starting small and building into a roar that shakes the valley. Deus vult, Deus vult. God wills it, God wills it. Kilij Arslan looks at the ridge where Godfrey's army is assembling. Then he looks at another ridge to the north. Another army appears there. It's the Count of Vermandois with more reinforcements. Then another force appears to the south, Bishop Adamar with his contingent. The Crusaders haven't just arrived as a single force. Through a combination of planning and pure luck, they have accidentally executed a perfect pincer movement, arriving from 3 different directions simultaneously. The Sultan's face goes pale as he realizes with terrifying clarity that he has stayed in this valley too long. He's been so focused on killing the wounded animal that he didn't notice the rest of the pack arriving. If Bohemond was the anvil for 7 hours, hard, unmoving, and taking a beating, then Godfrey of Bouillon was about to become the hammer that would smash the Turks into dust. For 7 agonizing hours, the Crusaders had been forced to play the Turks' game. They had been static targets in a mobile shooting gallery, unable to use their greatest strength. But now the rules of engagement had flipped completely. As Godfrey's knights crested the ridge in perfect formation, they didn't slow down to form a polite line and exchange challenges. They used the slope of the hill to build absolutely terrifying momentum. This is the moment when the Frankish charge, the defining tactic of medieval European warfare, finally came into play. Imagine the physics of it. Thousands of fresh horses, each weighing half a ton, clad in mail, and ridden by men screaming for vengeance, thundering downhill with gravity adding to their speed. The ground literally shook. Rocks tumbled down the slope ahead of them. The Seljuk Turks, who had spent the entire day circling and jeering, who had felt invincible shooting from a distance, suddenly found themselves in the absolute worst possible tactical position. They were stationary. Their horses were tired from hours of constant movement, and an avalanche of iron was falling on top of them with the weight of God's judgment. The collision was catastrophic. The Crusaders crashed into the Turkish flank like a freight train hitting a wooden fence. Light cavalry relies entirely on space and speed to survive. Robbed of both, in an instant the Turks were simply crushed by physics and weight. Their lightsabers bounced harmlessly off the heavy European shields. Their tired ponies were literally bowled over by the massive destriers bred specifically for this kind of impact. The hunters were being trampled by their prey. The reversal was total and brutal. But the true masterstroke didn't come from the warrior kings leading the charge. It came from a priest who understood warfare as well as he understood scripture. While Godfrey was smashing into the Turkish flank, and Bohemond was pushing out from the river like a released spring, a third force appeared that sealed the Turks' doom. Bishop Adhemar of Lapuy, the papal legate and spiritual leader of the Crusade, and a man who knew how to wield a lance as expertly as he wielded a cross, had executed a brilliant flanking maneuver.
He hadn't just marched toward the sound of battle.
He had taken his troops through the cover of the mountains to circle completely behind the enemy position. Suddenly smoke began to rise from the rear of the Turkish lines. Adhemar had attacked Kilij Arslan's own camp. He was burning their tents, seizing their supplies, killing their reserves and camp followers. For the Sultan, this was the final psychological breaking point that shattered his army. A soldier can fight when he's outnumbered. He can fight when he's tired. But he cannot fight when he looks over his shoulder and sees his home burning, his supplies destroyed, his family in danger. This is universal human psychology. The realization that they were completely surrounded, Bohemond in front, Godfrey on the flank, Adhemar in the rear, shattered the Seljuk army's morale instantly and completely. The discipline that had allowed them to maintain the carousel of death for 7 hours evaporated in seconds like morning dew in the sun. One Turkish rider turned his horse to flee. Then 10. Then 100. Then the entire army was running. The orderly Turkish force dissolved into a chaotic mob of terrified individuals, each man scrambling over his neighbor to escape the closing trap. The hunters had become the hunted, and now they were dying. The Crusaders, energized by the sight of their tormentors finally breaking and running, unleashed 7 hours of pent-up rage and frustration. They didn't just pursue the fleeing Turks. They hunted them with vengeful fury. The living porcupines, the men who'd stood bristling with arrows for hours, pulled the shafts from their armor and joined the chase with fresh energy born of pure hatred. The Valley of Dorylaeum, which had been a killing field for the Christians all day, was now transformed into a slaughterhouse for the Turks. The reversal was total. The pursuit lasted until nightfall, with men chasing enemies through the darkness by moonlight. The Crusaders, driven by adrenaline and the bitter memory of their dead horses and dead friends, chased the fleeing Turks for miles into the mountains. The supposedly invincible army of Kilij Arslan had disintegrated. The Sultan himself, the brilliant tactician who had planned this perfect trap, barely escaped with his life. He fled so quickly that he left behind his treasury, his tents, his supplies, and even his own family members who were captured by the pursuing Crusaders. When the exhausted Crusaders finally returned to the Valley of Dorylaeum, as the sun was setting, turning the blood-soaked ground orange and red. The battlefield had been completely transformed. The dust had settled. The screaming had stopped. The drums were silent. And as they walked cautiously into the abandoned Turkish camp, they realized the magnitude of their impossible victory. The Turkish camp was essentially a mobile city of canvas and silk, and it was filled with absolutely unimaginable wealth. The chroniclers describe a scene of delirious, almost drunken plundering. These men had been marching for months, starving and poor, their clothes in rags. Now they were wading through piles of gold dinars, silver vessels, and precious silks worth fortunes. But the most shocking discovery for these European knights wasn't even the gold. It was the animals. For the first time in their lives, many of these men saw camels. They had absolutely no idea what these strange creatures were. The Gesta Francorum amusingly notes that the Crusaders were completely baffled by these bizarre beasts with humps on their backs, but they happily loaded them up with loot anyway. The irony was almost poetic. The very animals that had been brought to carry the Crusaders' supplies into captivity were now carrying the Sultan's treasure back to the Crusader camp. The defeat was total, but the true prize of Dorylaeum wasn't the gold or the exotic animals. It was the strategic result. The battle had completely shattered the military power of the Seljuk Turks in western Anatolia. Kilij Arslan was so traumatized by the Frankish charge, by the sight of these iron men who could survive 1,000 arrows and then crush an army in minutes, that he adopted a completely different strategy. He never attacked the main Crusader army in open battle again. Instead, he implemented a scorched earth policy, burning crops and poisoning wells ahead of the Crusaders, then retreating deeper into the eastern deserts. He would harass them but never face them directly again. For the Crusaders, this victory was divine confirmation of their sacred mission. They had walked into a perfect trap. They had been outnumbered 3-1. They had been pinned down and systematically slaughtered for 7 hours. Logic said they should all be dead. Yet they had won decisively. They believed absolutely that God had sent saints to fight alongside them. The morale boost was incalculable. It transformed a group of desperate adventurers into a unified force of destiny.
However, the cost was absolutely staggering.
The field was covered with the bodies of 4,000 Christians. Nearly half of Bohemond's vanguard had been killed or wounded, but the loss of horses was catastrophic. Nearly every horse in Bohemond's vanguard had been killed by arrows. The knights were now reduced to walking. From this point forward, the First Crusade would be a march of endurance through hostile territory. What came next would test them even more than Dorylaeum had. In the end, the Battle of Dorylaeum is a historical anomaly that shouldn't exist. By all the established laws of military science, the First Crusade should have ended that day in total disaster. Bohemond's vanguard was completely outmaneuvered, outgunned, and trapped in a kill box specifically designed for the enemy's preferred tactics. They were fighting against a lighter, faster, and arguably more technologically advanced force that was perfectly suited to the terrain. They should have been wiped out to the last man with their bodies left for the vultures. But they weren't. Why? It wasn't just because Godfrey arrived at the last possible minute with reinforcements. That was crucial, yes, but it's not the whole story. The real reason they survived was because for 7 agonizing hours, under the blazing sun, 8,000 men and women simply refused to accept that they were already dead. They stood in the furnace of the Anatolian heat, watching their beloved horses die, watching their friends bleed out, watching arrows fall like rain, and they simply held the line. They didn't break. They didn't run. They just endured. We often look at history as a series of aggressive moves, charges, conquests, invasions, brilliant tactics. But Dorylaeum teaches us a profoundly different lesson about the nature of warfare and human endurance. It teaches us the often overlooked power of pure, stubborn endurance. Sometimes, victory isn't about how hard you can hit your enemy. It's about how long you can stand being hit without breaking. It's about absorbing punishment hour after hour and refusing to give up. Bohemond didn't win because he attacked brilliantly. He won because he knew how to suffer, how to endure, how to turn his army into an unbreakable rock that broke the wave of the Seljuk attack. The legacy of this single battle is immense beyond measure. If the Crusaders had fallen here, the entire history of the Middle East and Europe would have been rewritten. There would have been no Kingdom of Jerusalem, no series of Crusades, no Saladin rising to unite Islam, no Richard the Lionheart. The road to the Holy Land was literally paved with the iron will of the knights who stood fast in that valley. But as the Crusaders marched away from Dorylaeum, days later loaded with Turkish gold and leading strange caravans of confused camels, they were a fundamentally changed army. They had lost their dangerous arrogance. They had lost most of their precious horses. They were walking into a future that would only get harder and more brutal. The horrors of the siege of Antioch and the madness of Jerusalem still lay ahead. They had survived the trap at Dorylaeum, but the ghosts of that valley would walk with them forever. The memory of those 7 hours would haunt their dreams. Could they endure what was still to come? But let's talk about something the history books usually gloss over: the aftermath. What happened to the men who survived those 7 hours? The crusade continued, of course. They marched on toward Antioch and eventually Jerusalem, but the Battle of Dorylaeum changed them in ways that went beyond the physical wounds. The knights who had stood in that circle, who had watched their horses die, who had felt arrow after arrow strike their armor, developed something military psychologists today would recognize as combat trauma. They had faced their own mortality for 7 continuous hours. That changes you permanently. Many of them suffered from what we'd now call PTSD. They had nightmares about the sound of Turkish war drums. They flinched at sudden noises. Some became recklessly brave, having already faced the worst death could offer. Others became cautiously paranoid, never trusting open ground again. The Turkish soldiers who survived also carried scars. They had witnessed their perfect trap fail. They had seen their invincible tactics defeated. They had run in panic from enemies they'd been slaughtering minutes before. That shame and fear would affect Turkish military doctrine for decades. Kilij Arslan himself became obsessed with the Franks. He studied them. He tried to develop new tactics to counter them. But he never again tried to face them in a direct confrontation. The trauma of Dorylaeum had broken something in him. And what about the women who brought water? Most of them survived the battle. Some married knights afterward, their bravery having earned them respect and proposals. Others continued the pilgrimage to Jerusalem and settled there. A few became minor nobles in the newly conquered territories. But history didn't record their names. We have detailed accounts of every knight commander, every tactical decision, every movement of troops. But the women who kept the army alive, anonymous, forgotten, their courage reduced to a single line in a chronicle. That's the tragedy of history. We remember the swords, not the water carriers. We remember the charge, not the endurance. We remember Bohemond and Godfrey, but not the woman who stood beside them offering water while arrows fell like rain. The Battle of Dorylaeum was won by courage, yes. But it was also won by logistics, by endurance, by the unglamorous work of survival that doesn't make for exciting paintings or heroic songs. It was won by the people history forgets. Let's talk about the broader strategic implications, because Dorylaeum wasn't just about one day. It set the pattern for the entire First Crusade and influenced warfare for centuries. The Turks learned a crucial lesson: heavy European cavalry could not be defeated by mobility alone if they had time to form defensive positions. This led to a fundamental shift in Islamic military tactics throughout the region. Future Muslim armies invested more heavily in infantry and siege equipment to counter the Frankish advantage in defensive warfare. The Crusaders, meanwhile, learned to never again split their forces in hostile territory. The battle also established the psychological dynamic of the Crusades. The Christians saw it as divine intervention, proof that God was on their side. This religious certainty made them extraordinarily difficult to defeat psychologically. They believed they literally could not lose as long as they held faith. The Muslims conversely developed a healthy respect for Frankish stubbornness. They learned that these iron men from the West would not break easily. This respect influenced negotiations and treaties for decades. Neither side underestimated the other again. But perhaps the most interesting legacy is tactical. Dorylaeum proved that mobility wasn't everything. That defensive discipline could counter superior numbers and technology. Military academies from Ottoman Turkey to Napoleon's France studied this battle. The principle of elastic defense giving ground slowly while maintaining cohesion traces its roots back to what Bohemond did that day. The Crusaders also learned the value of combined arms. Godfrey's relief wasn't just heavy cavalry. It was coordinated infantry cavalry and even Bishop Adamar's flanking force. This multi-directional approach became standard Crusader doctrine. Modern military theory owes more to medieval battles like this than most people realize. Now here's a question worth pondering. What if Godfrey hadn't arrived in time? What if those messengers Bohemond sent had been killed? What if the main army had been just 1 hour later? The entire course of Western history changes. Without the First Crusade succeeding, there's no precedent for future crusades. European military expansion into the Mediterranean stalls for centuries. The balance of power between Christianity and Islam shifts dramatically. The Byzantine Empire, already weakening, likely falls to Turkish pressure decades or even centuries earlier. Without the influx of Eastern knowledge and technology that came through Crusader contact, the European Renaissance might be delayed or might never happen in the form we know. Jerusalem remains under Muslim control continuously. The ideological clash between Christianity and Islam takes a completely different form, probably less militarized. The entire concept of holy war might develop differently in Christian theology. On a smaller scale, if Bohemond dies at Dorylaeum, the entire political structure of Crusader states changes. He became Prince of Antioch and established a dynasty. Without him, that region develops under different leadership with different alliances. But Godfrey did arrive. History happened the way it happened. An understanding that helps us appreciate just how contingent historical events really are. Dorylaeum wasn't inevitable. The survival wasn't guaranteed. It was a desperately close thing that could have gone either way. That's what makes the story so compelling. These weren't superheroes with plot armor. They were real people who made it through by sheer, stubborn refusal to die, by holding formation when every instinct screamed to run, by bringing water when arrows filled the sky, by arriving just in time after an impossible march. History is made of these moments where everything hangs by a thread and human courage, luck, and timing decide the fate of nations. Dorylaeum was one of those moments. And 8,000 people who should have died that day somehow didn't. That's not just a military victory. That's a testament to the human capacity to endure.
What's the final takeaway from the Battle of Dorylaeum? What does this 1,000-year-old battle teach isn't everything?
The Turks had superior mobility, superior range, superior tactical doctrine for that terrain. By every metric, they should have won easily. But they lost because they couldn't break the enemy's will. Second, discipline under pressure is more valuable than aggression. Bohemond's greatest moment wasn't when he charged bravely. It was when he ordered his men to stop charging and just stand there taking punishment. That counterintuitive decision saved them all. Third, never underestimate the power of logistics and support. Those women carrying water weren't peripheral to the battle. They were central to survival. Military historians who ignore logistics and focus only on tactics miss half the story. Fourth, timing is everything. Godfrey's relief force arrived at literally the last possible moment. 10 minutes later, the shield wall might have broken. 30 minutes later, it would have been too late. Success often comes down to being in the right place at exactly the right time. Finally, history is made by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We remember the names of a few leaders, but 8,000 mostly anonymous people survived that day through collective courage and determination. They're the real heroes. The Battle of Dorylaeum should have been a footnote the day the First Crusade died in an Anatolian valley. Instead, it became the day that proved the Crusades might actually succeed. It was the crucible that forged a group of separate armies into a unified force. It was the trial by fire that showed them they could survive anything. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most intense battles compelling, please subscribe to Maproom Battles. We're dedicated to bringing you these forgotten stories of survival and warfare that shaped our world. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode where we follow these survivors to Antioch, where they'll face starvation, betrayal, and a siege that makes Dorylaeum look like a minor skirmish. I want to hear from you in the comments. Could you have stood in that shield wall for 7 hours? Could you have been one of those women running water to the front lines? What would you have done in Bohemon's position? Let's discuss this incredible moment in history. Thank you for joining me on Maproom Battles for this journey into the past. Remember, these aren't just stories about dates and battles. These are stories about real people facing impossible odds and somehow finding the strength to survive. Until next time, keep exploring history with us.